Shall we start? I am Lady Rain. This is the Reader's Nook. We are on Section 2, Chapter 10, Part. I noticed there's dates on these, so we'll have to see what these dates are about. Really? I ain't even yawned, and now we're going to start yawning. Oy. Wednesday, August 3rd. Andy Bossman, who had been Haven's only realtor up until 3 weeks ago, when he simply closed his office, had discovered the mind reading was something a fellow got used to very quickly. He didn't realize how quickly or how much he had come to depend on it till it was his turn to go on. Oh, give me a break. To go on out to Bobby's place to help and to keep an eye on the drunk. Part of his problem? He knew it was going to be a problem after talking to Enders and Tremaine lad. Was being this close to the ship. It was like standing next to the biggest power generator in the world. Constant eddies and flows of its weird force ran over his skin like skirling sand devils in the desert. I don't like this yawning. I don't know why I'm yawning. Some ideas would float dreamlessly, making it impossible to concentrate on what he was doing. Sometimes the exact opposite would occur. Thought would break up completely, like a microwave transmission, interrupted by a burst of ultraviolet rays. But most of it was just the physical fact of the chip, looming there like something out of a dream. It was exhilarating, awe-inspiring, frightening, wonderful. Bosman thought. He now understood how the Israelites must have felt carrying the Ark of the Covenant through the desert. Point. In one of his sermons, the Reverend Gilringer said that some fellow had ventured to stick his head in there, just to see what all the shouting was about, and he was dropped dead on the spot, because it had been God in there. There might be a kind of God in that ship, too, Andy thought. And even if that God had fled, it had left some residue, some of itself. And thinking about it made it hard to keep your mind on the business at hand. Then there was Gardner's unsettling blankness. You keep running into it like a closed door that should have been opened. You'd yell at him to hand you something, and he would go right on with what he was doing. Just no response. Or you'd go to tune in on him, some sort of fall into the run of his thoughts, like picking up a telephone on a party line to see who was talking. And there would be no one there, no one at all, nothing but a dead line. There was a buzz from the intercom nailed to the inside wall of the lean-to. Its wire ran across the muddy, churned ground and into the trench from which the ship jutted. Bosman flipped the toggle over to talk. I'm here. The charge is set, Gardner said. Haul me up. He sounded very, very tired. He had thrown himself a pretty fair country drunk last night, Bosman thought, judging by the sound of the puking he had heard from the back porch around midnight. And when he glanced into Gardner's room this morning, he had seen blood on his pillow. Right away. The episode with Anders had taught them all that when Gardner asked to be brought up, you didn't waste time. I gotta stop this yawning. There ain't no need for it. He went to the windlass and began to crank. It was a pain in the ass, having to do this by hand, but there was a temporary shortage of batteries again. Within another week, and everything here would be running like clockwork, except Bosman doubted if he would be here to see it. Being near the ship was exhausting. Being near Gardner was exhausting in a different way. There we go. Twisted my eyelashes by accident. I think that's what it was. It was like being near a loaded gun with a hair trigger. The way he had sucker punched poor John Enders now. The only reason John hadn't known it was coming was because Gardner was such an infuriating blank. Every now and then a bubble of thought, partial or complete, would rise to the surface of his mind, as readable as a newspaper headline. That was all. Maybe Enders had it coming. Osmond knew that he wouldn't be too nuts about being stuck at the bottom of a trench with one of those explosive radios. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Johnny hadn't been able to see it coming. Gardner could do anything at any time, and no one could stop him, because no one could see it coming. Andy Bosman almost wished Bobby would die so they could get rid of him. It would be tougher with just Havenites working on the project, true. It would slow them down, but it would almost be worth it. The way he came out of left field at you was so fucking unsettling. This morning, for instance, coffee break. Bosman sitting on a stump eating some of those little peanut butter and cracker sandwiches and drinking iced coffee from his thermos. He had always preferred hot coffee to cold, even in warm weather. But since he'd lost his teeth, really hot drinks seemed to bother him. Gardner had been sitting cross-legged, like one of those yoga masters on a dirty swatch of tarpaulin, eating an apple and drinking a beer. Osmond didn't see how anyone could eat an apple and drink a beer at the same time, especially in the morning. But Gardner was doing it. From here, Osmond could see the scar an inch or so above Gardner's left eyebrow. The steel plate would be under that scar. Gardner had turned his head and caught Bosman looking at him. Bosman flushed, wondering if Gardner was going to start to yell and rant. If maybe he was going to come over here and try to sucker punch him the way he had Johnny Enders. If he tries that, Bosman thought, curling his hands into fists, he's going to find that I'm no sucker. Instead, Gardner had begun to speak in a clear, carrying voice. There was a small, cynical smile on his mouth as he did it. After a moment, Osmond realized he wasn't just speaking, he was reciting. The man was sitting out here in the woods, cross-legged on a dirty tarp, hung over out of his mind, the glittering body of the ship in the earth casting moving ripples of reflection on his cheek, reciting like a schoolboy. The man was unfucking stable. Osmond could tell the world. Would tell the world. He sincerely wanted Gardner dead. Tom gave up the brush with reluctance in his face, but alacrity in his heart, Gardner said, eyes half closed, face turned up toward the warm morning sun. That little smile never left his lips. And while the late streamer Big Missouri sweated in the sun, the retired artist sat on a barrel in the shade close by, dangled his legs, munched his apple, and planned the slaughter of more innocents. What? Andy began, but Gardner, his smile now spreading into a genuine, if none the less cynical grin, overrode him. There was no lack of material. Boys happened along every little while. They came to jeer, but they remained to whitewash. By the time Ben was fagged out, Tom had traded the next chance to Billy Fisher for a kite in good repair. And when he played out, Johnny Miller brought in a dead rat and a string to swing it with. Gardner drank the rest of his beer, belched and stretched. You never brought me a dead rat and a string to swing it with, but I've got an intercom, Bozzy. And I guess that's a start, huh? I don't know what you're talking about, Bosman said slowly. He had only gotten 2 years of college, business admin, before having to drop out and go to work. His father had a heart condition and chronic high blood pressure. High-flown fellows like this made him nervous and angry, lording it over ordinary folks, as if being able to quote from something written by someone who had died a long time ago made their shit smell sweeter than other people's. Gardner said, that's okay. It's from chapter 2 of Tom Sawyer. When Bobby was a kid back in Utica, 7th grade, they had this thing called junior exhibition. It was a recitation competition. She didn't want to be in it, but her sister Annie decided she ought to be. That it would be good for her, or something. And when Sister Annie decided something, brother, it was decided. Annie was a real tartar then, Bozzy. She's a real tartar now. At least I guess she is. I haven't seen her in a long time, and that's the way. Oh ho. Uh-huh, I like it. But I think it's fair to say she's still the same. People like her very rarely change. Don't call me Bozzy, Andy said, hoping he sounded more dangerous than he felt. I don't like it. When I had Bobbi in freshman comp, she wrote once about how she froze trying to recite Tom Sawyer. I just about cracked up. Gardner got to his feet and started walking toward Andy, a development the ex-realtor viewed with active alarm. I saw her after class the next day and asked her if she still remembered how whitewashing the fence went. She did. I wasn't surprised. There are some things you never forget, like when your sister or your mother bulldoze you into some horror show like Junior X. You may forget the piece when you're standing up there in front of all those people. Otherwise, you could recite it on your deathbed. Look, Andy said, we ought to get back to work. I let her get about 4 sentences in, then I joined her. Her jaw dropped almost down to her knees. Then she started grinning, and we went through it together, word for word. It wasn't so strange. We were both shy kids, Bobbi and I. Her sister was a dragon in front of her cave. My mother was a dragon in front of mine. Oh, in front of her cave. My mother was the dragon in front of mine. I can itch. People like that often get this very weird idea that the way to cure a shy kid is to put him into a sort of situation he dreads the most. Something like Junior X. It wasn't even much of a coincidence that we both gotten that whitewashing thing by heart. The only one more popular for recitation is The Telltale Heart. Gardner drew a breath and screamed, Stop, fiends! Dissemble no more! Tear up the floorboards! Here! 'Tis the beating of his hideous heart. Andy had uttered a small shriek. He dropped his thermos and a half cup of cold coffee stained the crotch of his pants. Uh-oh, Bozzy. Gardner said, Really? While I'm reading? You gotta blow your nose right there? Uh-huh. Sorry. And he backs up a foot. Uh-oh, Bozzy, Gardner said conversationally. Never get that out of those polyester slacks. Only difference between the two of us was that I didn't freeze, Gardner said. In fact, I won a second prize ribbon. But it didn't cure my fear of talking in front of crowds. Only made it worse. Whenever I stand up in front of a group to read poetry, I look at all those hungry eyes. I think of whitewashing the fence. Also, I think about Bobbi. Sometimes that's enough to get me through. Anyway, it made us friends. I don't see what any of that has to do with getting this work done, Andy cried in a hectoring voice utterly unlike him. But his heart had been beating too fast. For a moment there, when Gardner had shrieked, he really had believed the man had gone insane. You don't see what this has to do with whitewashing the fence? Gardner asked and laughed. Then you must be blind, Bozzy. He pointed to the ship leaning skyward at its perfect 45-degree angle, rising out of the wide trench. We're digging it up instead of whitewashing it. But that doesn't change the principle a bit. I have fagged out Bobby Tremaine and John Enders, and if you're back tomorrow, I'll eat your hush puppies. Thing is, I never seem to get any prizes for it. You tell whoever comes out tomorrow, I want a dead rat and a string to swing it by, Bozzy. Or a bully taw, at the very least. Gardner had stopped halfway to the trench. He looked around at Andy. Andy's failure to read this big man with the sloping shoulders and the indistinct, oddly broken face, had never made Bosman more uncomfortable than it did then. Better still, Bozzy, Gardner had said in a voice so soft Andy hardly heard it. Get Bobby out here tomorrow. I'd like to find out if the new improved Bobby still remembers how to recite Whitewashing the Fence from Tom Sawyer. Then, without another word, he had gone to the sling and waited for Andy to lower him down. If that whole thing hadn't been left field, Oh my God, hiccups. Thing one thing, it's another. Hadn't been left field, Andy didn't know what was. And he added to himself, as he turned the winch, that had only been Gardner's first beer of the day. He put away another 5 or 6 at lunch, and he'll put away 5 or 6 at lunch and then really get wild and crazy. Gardner now came swaying to the top of the trench, and Andy had an urge to let go of the windlass crank, solve the problem, except he couldn't. Gardner belonged to Bobbi Anderson, and until Bobby either died or came out of the shed, things had to go on pretty much as they were. Come on, Bozzy, some of these rocks fly a long way. He started toward the lean-to. Andy fell in beside him, hurrying to keep up. I told you I don't like you calling me Bozzy, he said. Gardner spared him a curiously flat glance. I know, he said. They went around the lean-to. What the hell is a lean-to? Oh, it's like a little covered, like, it's like a covered shed with no walls, except for one wall back. That makes sense. Okay. Lean-to about 3 minutes later, another of those loud, crumpling roars shuddered out of the trench. A spray of rocks rose into the sky and came down, rattling off the hull of the ship with dull clangs and clogs. Well, Bozzy began. Gardner grabbed his arm. His head was tilted, his face alert, his eyes dark and lively. Shh. Andy wrenched his arm away. What in the hell's wrong with you? Don't you hear it? I don't hear. And then he did. Hissing sound. Like a giant tea kettle was coming from the trench. It was growing. A mad excitement suddenly seized Andy. There was more than a little terror in it. It's them, he whispered, and turned toward Guard. His eyes were the size of doorknobs. His lips, shiny with loose spittle, were trembling. They weren't dead. We woke them up. They're coming out. Jesus is coming, and he's pissed. And is he pissed? Gardner remarked, unimpressed. The hissing grew louder. Now there was another crunching thud. This wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of something heavy collapsing. A moment later, something else collapsed. Andy. The strength ran out of his legs, and he fell to his knees. It's them, it's them, it's them, he slobbered. Gardner hooked a hand into the man's armpit, wincing a little at the hot, jungly dampness there, and pulled him to his feet. That's not the Tommyknockers, he said. It's water. Huh? Bosman looked at him with dazed incomprehension. Water, Gardner cried, giving Bosman a brisk little shake. We just brought in our swimming pool, Bozzy. What? The hiss suddenly exploded into a soft, steady roar. Water jutted out of the trench and into the sky in a widening sheet. This was no column of water. It was as if a giant child had just pressed his finger over a giant faucet to watch the water spray everywhere. Oh my God. I remember doing that as a kid. At the bottom of the trench, water was driving up through the number of fissures in just that way. Water? Andy asked weakly. He couldn't get it right in his mind. Gardner didn't reply. Rainbows danced in the water. It ran down the sleek hull of the ship in rivets, leaving beads behind. And as he watched, he saw those drops begin to skitter, the way water flicked into hot fat on a griddle. The way water flicked into hot fat on a griddle will skitter and hop. Only this was not random. The drops were lining up in obedience to lines of force which ran down the hull of the ship like lines of longitude on the globe. I can't see it, Gardner thought. I can see the force radiating from the ship's skin of the drops. Oh, I can see it. I thought he said he can't. My God. There was another crunch. Gardner seemed to feel the earth actually drop a bit under his feet at the bottom of the trench. Water pressure was finishing the work the blasting had begun, widening fissures and holes, pulling the friable rock apart. More water began to escape more easily. The sheets of spray fell back. A last diffuse rainbow wavered in the air and disappeared. Gardner saw the ship shift as the rock weld which had prisoned it so long ago. It moved so slightly, it might have been imagination, but it wasn't. In a brief moment, he could see how it would look coming out of the ground. He could see its shadow rippling slowly over the ground as it came up and out. Could hear the unearthly wailing of its hull scraping over the bones of bedrock. Could sense everything, and Haven looking this way as it rose into the sky, hot and glittering, a monstrous silver coin slowly heeling over to the horizontal for the first time in a millennia, floating soundlessly in the sky, floating free. He wanted it. He wanted that. God, right or wrong, he wanted that so bad. Gardner gave his head a brisk shake, as if to clear it. Come on, he said, let's take a look. Without waiting, Gardner walked across the trench and looked in. He could hear rushing water, but it was hard to see. He attached one of the big legs they used for night work to the stirrup of the sling and lowered it about 10 feet. That was plenty. If he had lowered it another 10, it would have been under water. It had been a lake they had broken into, all right. No joke. The trench was filling rapidly. After a moment, Andy joined him. His face was wretched. All that work, he cried. Did you bring your diving board, Bozzy? Are you going to have free swim on Thursdays or Friday? Shut up, Andy Bosman screamed at him. Shut up, I hate you. Wild hysteria washed over Gardner. He staggered away to a stump and sat down, wondering if the goddamn thing had stayed watertight all these years. Wondering what the fair market price was for a flying saucer with water damage. He began to laugh. Even when Andy Bosman came over and hit him upside the face and knocked him onto the ground, Jim Gardner couldn't stop laughing. This is called the Book of Days, the town concluded. Yes, can I help you? Thursday, August 4th. When it got to be 8:45 and still no one showed up, Gardner began to wonder if maybe they were quitting. He toyed with the idea as he sat in Bobby's rocker on the porch, fingering the big puffy bruise on the side of his face where Bosman had clouted him. A bunch of them had been out at Archambault's Cadillac again. After midnight, mostly the same bunch. Another midnight shed party. Gardner had hiked himself up on one elbow and watched them through the guest room window, wondering who brought the chips and dip to these stories. They were just shadows grouped around a long front end of the Coupe de Ville. They stood there for a moment and then went to the shed. When they opened the door, that viciously bright light poured out in the flood that lit the entire yard and guest room itself with a sick radium dial glow. They went inside. The glow faded down to a thick, vertical bar, but didn't go out entirely. They had left the door ajar. Folks in that little jerkwater Maine town were now the brightest people on earth. Apparently, not even they had been able to figure out how to padlock the door from the outside. And they hadn't thought to put one on the inside. Now, sitting on the porch and looking toward the village, Gardner thought, maybe when they get inside there, they get too exalted to think of mundane things like padlocks. He shaded his eyes with one hand. The truck was coming. A big old pulp truck that was vaguely familiar. There was a tarpaulin over something in the back. It flapped casually in the wind. Gardner knew it was going to turn in, and of course they hadn't given up. Woke up last night in the guest room bed, saw the folks going into the Tommyknockers shed. Could have looked in, but I didn't quite dare. Don't want to know what goes on in there. He didn't think somehow that the judges of the Yale Younger Poets competition would think much of it, but, Gardner thought, this is where Jim Gardner is now, as they say. Maybe later on they'll call it my Tommyknocker phase, or my shed period, or... The truck changed to a lower gear and came groaning into Bobby's dooryard. The engine died with a wheeze. The man in the strapped style t-shirt who got out was a man who had given guard his ride to the Haven Town line on July 4th. I recognized the man at once. Coffee, he thought. You gave coffee with a lot of sugar in it. Tasted good. He looked like an extra from a James Dickey novel about those city boys and their weekend canoe trip down the Kahulawasi, the river. Gardner didn't think the man was from Haven, though. Hadn't he said Albion? Stuff's spreading, he thought. Well, why not? It's fallout, isn't it? And Albion's downwind. "'Lo there," the truck driver said. "Guess you don't remember me," his tone added. "Don't fuck with me, Fred." "Yes, I do," Guard said, and the name rose magically in his mind, even after all this, single month that seemed more like 10 years. With all these strange events. Freeman Moss. "Give me a ride. I'm coming to check on Bobbi." "Oh, Freeman Moss gave me a ride. I'm coming to check on Bobbi, and I guess you knew that. You know that." "Ah, yeah?" Moss went to the back of the truck and began pulling slip knots and yanking rope. "Want to give me a help with this?" Gardner started down the steps and stopped, smiling a little. First Tremaine, then Enders, then Bosman, with his somehow pitiful pale yellow polyester pants. "Sure," he said. "Just tell me one thing." "Ah, yep." Moss left off pulling the ropes. He flipped back the tarpaulin, and Gardner saw about what he had expected. A weird conglomeration of equipment. Tanks, hoses, 3-car batteries nailed to a board. A new and improved pump. "Well, if I can." Gardner grinned without much humor. "Did you bring me a dead rat and a string to swing it with?" Friday, August 5th. Part 9. Seems each day is a different part. No air traffic had overflown Haven on a regular basis since the late 1960s, when Dow Air Force Base in Bangor had closed down. If anyone had uncovered the ship in the earth back in those days, there might have been trouble. There had been Air Force fighter planes that zoom in overhead 4 or 5 times a day, rattling windows and sometimes breaking them with sonic booms. The pilots were supposed to boom over the continental United States unless absolutely necessary. But the hotshots who flew the F-4s, most of them with adolescent acne still fading from their cheeks and foreheads, sometimes got a little exuberant. Excuse me. The jets made the Mustangs and Chargers these overgrown boys had been driving only a year before look mighty tame. When Dow closed, there was still a few Air National Guard flights. The patterns were shifted north toward Loring in Limestone. Excuse me. After some dithering, the base was turned into a commercial airfield named Bangor International Airport. I don't know why I got a cough. I got a tickle in my throat. Some thought the name rather grand for an airport that serviced a few wheezy Northeast airlines flights to Boston each day and a handful of puddle jumper pipers bound for Augusta and Portland. But the air traffic eventually grew. And by 1983, BIA had become a thriving air terminal. Besides serving 2 commercial airlines, it was also a refueling point for many international carriers, and so it finally earned its grand name. For a while, some commercial airlines did overfly Haven. That was in the early 70s. But pilots and navigators regularly reported radar problems in the area coded Quadrant G3. A square wick took in most of Haven, all of Albion, and the China Lakes region. This cloudy interference, known as popcorn or echo haze, or even more colorfully as ghost herds, is also reported regularly over the Bermuda Triangle. Maybe there's a spaceship in the water. Compasses went wacky. Sometimes there was funny cuckoo electrical glitches in the equipment. In 1973, a Delta jet southbound from BIA to Boston nearly collided with a TWA jet bound from London to Chicago. Drinks on both planes were spilled. The TWA stewardess was scalded by hot coffee. No one but the flight crews knew how close it had been. Oh, I don't know why now. The co-pilot on the Delta plane ran a hot special delivery into his pants, laughed hysterically all the way to Boston, and quit flying forever 2 days later. In 1974, a big sky charter jet loaded with happy gamblers bound for Las Vegas from Bangor and the Canadian Maritimes lost power in one engine over Haven and had to return to Bangor. When the engine was restarted on the ground, it ran fine. Excuse me. There was another near miss in 1975. By 1979, all commercial air traffic had been routed out of the area. If you asked the FAA controller about it, he only would have shrugged and called it a dragon. It was a word they used. There were such places here and there. No one knew why. It was easier to route planes away and forget it. By 1982, private air traffic was also being routinely vectored away from G3 by controllers in Augusta, Waterville, and Bangor. So no pilot had seen a shiny object winking from the exact center of map square G3 on FAA map ECUS2. Not until Peter Bailey saw it on the afternoon of August 5th. Bailey was a private pilot with 200 hours on his own in the air. He flew a Cessna Hawk XP, and he would have been the first to tell you that it had cost him a few banana skins. This was Peter Bailey's phrase for money. He found it hilarious. The Hawk cruised at 150 miles an hour and had good sky capability, 17,000 feet without breathing hard. The Cessna Nav Pack made it hard to get lost. The original nav antenna had also cost a few banana skins. In other words, it was a good plane. One that could damn near fly itself, only it didn't have to with a good pilot like him driving. If Peter Bailey had a bitch, it was the goddamn insurance. It was highway robbery. And he had bored his golfing partners to tears with the outrage the insurance companies had foisted on him. He had friends who flew. He assured them grimly, plenty of them, a lot with less hours on their license than he had were forking over fewer banana skins to the insurance heathens than he was. Some were guys he wouldn't have flown with, he said, if they owned the last plane on Earth and his wife was in Denver dying of a brain hemorrhage. And the amount was the greatest humiliation of all. The greatest humiliation of all was that he, Peter Bailey, a respected neurosurgeon who made well over 300,000 bananas a year, had to accept pool coverage if he wanted to fly. Well, he told his captive audiences, who often wished fervently that they had only played the front nine or better, had stayed in the bar and soaked up a few Bloody Marys. Full coverage was assigned risk coverage, the sort teenagers and convicted drunks had to carry on their cars. Shit. That wasn't goddamn discrimination. He didn't know what was. If he wasn't such a busy man, he'd slap the bastards with a class action suit, and he'd win, too. Many of Bailey's golf companions were lawyers. Most knew it wouldn't wash. Risk coverage was made on the basis of actual tables. And the fact was, Peter Bailey wasn't just a neurosurgeon, he was a doctor, and doctors had the worst record as private pilots of any professional group in the world. After escaping one of these foursomes, one of the players remarked as Bailey headed toward the clubhouse, still fuming, I wouldn't even drive to Denver with a long-winded son of a bitch if my wife was dying of a brain hemorrhage. Peter Bailey was exactly the sort of flyer for whom the tables had been invented. There were undoubtedly doctors all over the world. There were undoubtedly doctors all over America, who were exemplary pilots. Bailey wasn't one of them. Quick and decisive in the operating theater when the Patient lay before him, with a window of skull cut away to reveal the pinkish-gray brain tissue, as delicate as a dancer with scalpel and laser knife. He was a ham-fisted pilot, constantly violated assigned altitudes, FAA safety rules, and his own flight patterns. He was a bold pilot, but with only 200 hours on his license, he could by no stretch of the imagination be called an old pilot. His status as an assigned risk only confirmed the old saw. A pilot may be one or the other, but no pilot is both. He was flying alone that day from Teterboro, outside New York, to Bangor. At Bangor, he would rent a car and drive to Derry Home Hospital. He had been asked to consult in the case of Hillman Brown, because the case was interesting and the price right, and because he had heard good things about the golf course in Orono. He had agreed. The weather had been clear the whole way, the air smooth. Bailey had enjoyed the trip tremendously. As usual, his logbook was botched. He had missed one VOR beacon entirely, and had decided another must be on the blink. He had hit the frequency dial with his elbow. He had wandered from his assigned altitude 11,000 feet at as high as 15,000 and as low as 6,000, and had once again avoided killing anyone, a blessing he was unfortunately too stupid to count. He also wandered well off his flight path, and so happened to overfly Haven, where a great blink of light suddenly flicked into his eye. It was as if someone had just flashed the lid of the world's biggest Crisco can up at him. What in the Sam Hill? He looked down and saw a tantalizing glimmer of that brightness. He might have dismissed it, might have gone on, survived the fight yet another day, or perhaps to collide with a fully loaded airliner. But he was early and intrigued. He banked the Hawk and went back. Now where? It flashed again, bright enough to dazzle a blue crescent of afterimage into his eyes. Ripples of light ran across the top of the pilot's cabin. Jesus! There below him in the clearing, in the gray-green woods, was a huge silver object. He could tell little about it before it was gone again under the port wing. At 6,000 feet for the second time that day, Bailey banked back again. His head had begun to ache. He noticed this and dismissed it as excitement. His first thought had been that it was a water tower. No one would locate a water tower that big in the woods. He overflew the object again, this time at 4,000. He had the Hawk throttled back as far as he dared, which was a good deal further than a more experienced pilot would have dared to. But the Hawk was a good plane, and it forgave him. Artifact, he thought this time, almost sick with excitement. A great dish-shaped artifact in the earth. Some government thing. But if it was government, how come it wasn't covered with a camouflage net? And the ground around it had been excavated. From up here, the trench cut into the earth was perfectly clear. Bailey determined to overfly it again. Hell, he buzzed it. And then his eye fell on the gauges and his heart took an unsteady leap. His compass was winding itself around in big, stupid circles. The tank indicators were flashing red. The altimeter suddenly ran up to 22,000 feet, stopped briefly, and then dropped back to dead zero. The Hawk's husky 195 horsepower motor gave a terrifying hitch. The nose dipped. Bailey's heart did the same. His head throbbed. In front of his bulging eyes, needles were whirling. Lights flashed from green to red like pygmy traffic signals. And the altitude warning beeper, which was supposed to tell a bemused pilot, "Wake up, dummy, you're about to run into a large, immovable object called Mother Earth," began to sound, even though it wasn't supposed to go off until the plane passed through 500, and Bailey's own eyes told him the Hawk was still at least 4,000 feet, perhaps a bit more. He looked at the digital thermometer, which recorded the outside temperature. It blinked from 47 to 58, then to 5. It paused there for a moment, then showed 999. The red numerals held there, pulsing distractedly, and then the thermometer shorted out. What in Christ's name is going on here? Bailey screamed and was stupidly amazed to see one of his front teeth fly out of his mouth, bounce off the airspeed indicator, and fall to the floor. The engine hitched again. Fuck, he whispered. He was now sick with fright. Blood from the socket where his tooth had been trickled down his chin. A drop splashed on his Lacoste shirt. The gleaming thing in the earth passed under his wings again. The Hawk's engine ran choppily and stalled. It began to lose altitude. Forgetting all his training, Bailey hauled up on the wheel as hard as he could, but the silent plane couldn't answer. Bailey's head pounded and thudded. The Cessna dropped 4,000 feet, 3,500, 3,000. Bailey groped out with one hand like a blind man and thumbed the button marked emergency restart. High-test avgas boomed hollowly into the Hawk's carbs. The propeller jerked and stopped again. Now the Cessna had slid down to 2,500 feet. Passed over the old dairy road close enough for Bailey to be able to see the surface board in front of the Methodist church. Motherfuck, he whispered, I'm gonna die. He pulled the choke all the way out and hit the restart button again. The engine coughed, ran for a while, began to stutter. No, Bailey screamed, one eye ruptured and filled up with blood. The blood sheeted thinly down his left cheek. In his panicky, terrorized state, he didn't even notice. He slammed the choke in again. No, don't you stall, you rat shit plane. The engine roared. The propeller blurred into invisibility with a wedge of reflected sunshine in it. Bailey hauled up on the wheel. The overburdened Hawk began to lug again. Rat shit plane, rat shit plane, rat shit plane, he screamed. His left eye was now full of blood, and he was on some level aware that the world seemed to have taken on a strange pinkish aspect. And if he'd thought it no more than rage, and he would, and if he'd had the time or inclination to think about this at all, he would have thought it no more than rage at this idiotic situation. He let off the wheel. The Hawk, allowed to climb at an angle which was almost sane, began to buckle down, do its job again. Haven Village passed beneath it, and Bailey was aware of people looking up at him. He was low enough so someone could take his number if they thought of it. Go ahead, he said grimly. Go ahead, take it, because when I finish with Cessna Corporation, every goddamn stockholder they have is going to be standing in his underwear. I'm going to sue those negligent sons of bitches for every banana skin they've got. The Hawk was rising smoothly now, its engine smooth and sweet. Bailey's head was trying to tear itself right off his shoulders, but an idea suddenly came to him. An idea of such stupefying simplicity and staggering ramifications that everything else was driven from his mind. He understood nothing less than the psychological basis of bicamerality in the human brain. This led to an instant understanding of race memory, not as a lazy Jungian concept, but as a function of recombinant DNA and biological imprinting. And with this came an understanding of what the increasing Milliard generating capacity of the corpus callosum during periods of increased ductless gland activity, which had puzzled students for the human brain for 30 years, actually meant. Peter Bailey suddenly understood that actual time travel, was in his grasp. At the same instant, a large portion of his brain exploded. White light flashed in his head, white light exactly like the reflection that had winked at him from the object in the woods. If he collapsed forward, pushing the wheel in, the people of Haven would have another mess on their hands. But instead, he fell backward, head lolling on his neck, blood running from his ears. He stared up at the ceiling of the pilot's compartment with an expression of stupendous, terminal surprise printed on his face. If the Cessna's autopilot had been engaged, it certainly would have flown serenely on until it ran out of fuel. Weather conditions were optimum, and such things have happened before. As it was, it flew along almost dead level at 5,500 feet for 5 minutes anyway. The radio squawked at the dead neurosurgeon, telling him to get his ass up to his assigned altitude right now. Over Derry, a wind current threw the plane into a gentle bank. It flew in a long, looping arc toward Newport. The bank grew steeper, turned into a spiral. The spiral became a spin. The kid fishing off the bridge in Route 7 looked up, saw the plane falling out of the sky, and whirled like a screw auger as it did. He stared open-mouthed at it as it crashed in Ezra Dockery's north field and exploded into a pillar of flame. "Holy jeezum," the kid yelled. He dropped his fishing pole and ran for the Newport Mobile up the road to call the fire department. Shortly after he left, a bass snatched the worm and pulled his pole into the water. The kid never found the pole, but in the excitement of fighting a grass fire in Docker's field and pulling the crispy pilot out of the remains of the Cessna, he barely noticed. 10. Saturday, August 6th. Newt and Dickie were sitting in the Haven lunch. The newspaper was between them. The lead story was another outbreak of hostilities in the Mideast. The story that concerned them that morning was below that fold. Neurosurgeon killed in light plane crash, the headline read. There was a photo of the plane. Nothing recognizable remained of the once beautiful Cessna Hawk except for its tail. Their breakfasts were pushed to one side, mostly untouched. Molly Fenderson, Beach's niece, was cooking now that Beach was dead. Molly was a hell of a nice girl. Her fried eggs looked like broiled assholes. Dick thought they tasted that way, too. Although he'd never actually eaten an asshole, broiled or any other way. Might have, Newt said. Dick looked at him, eyebrows raised. They put damn near anything in hot dogs. At least, that's what I read once. Dick's gut rolled over. He told Newt to shut his fucking gob. Newt paused, then said, "Must have been 20-30 people seen that idiot come low across the village." "All from town?" Dickie asked. "Yes." "Then we have no problem, do we?" "No, I don't think so," Newt replied, sipping coffee. "At least, not unless it happens again." Dick shook his head. "Shouldn't do. Paper says he was off course." "Yeah, so it said. You ready?" "Sure." They left without paying. Money had ceased to hold much interest to the residents of Haven. There were several large cardboard cartons of cash in Dickie Allison's basement, carelessly tucked into the old coal-holed 20s, 10s, and 1s mostly. Haven was a small town. When people needed cash for something, they came and got some. The house is unlocked. Besides telepathic typewriters and water heaters that ran on the power of collapsing molecules, Haven had discovered a nearly perfect form of collectivism. On the sidewalk in front of the lunch, they stared toward the town hall. The brick clock tower was flickering uneasily. One moment it was there, solid as the Taj Mahal, if not so beautiful. The next, there was only blue sky above the jagged ruin of the tower's base. Then it would come back. Its long morning shadow fluttered like the shadow of the wind shade blown by the intermittent wind. Newt found the fact that sometimes the shadow of the clock tower was there when the tower itself was not particularly disturbing. "Christ, if I look at that sucker too long, I'll go batshit," Dick said. Newt asked if someone was taking care of the deterioration. Tommy Jacklin and Hester Brookline, have had to go up to Derry. Dick said. They're supposed to go to about 5 different service stations plus both auto parts stores. I sent Deeren near $700 with them. Told them to come back with as many as 20 car batteries, and if they could. But they're supposed to spread the buy around. There's people in some of the towns around here that think folks have gone battery crazy in Haven. Tommy Jacklin and Hester Brooklyn? Newt asked dubiously. Christ, they're just kids. Has Tommy got a driver's license, Dick? No, Dick said reluctantly. But he's 15 and he's got a permit and he drives real safe. But he's big. Looks older than he really is. He'll be okay. Christ, it's so fucking risky. It is, but they communed in thoughts that were more images than words. This was happening more and more in Haven, as the people in town learned this strange new thought language. For all of his misgivings, Newt understood the basic problem that had caused Dick to send the couple of underage kids to Derry in the Fannon's pickup truck. They needed batteries. Needed them. But it was getting harder and harder for the people who lived in Haven to leave Haven. If a codger like Dave Rutledge or an old coot like John Harley tried it, he would be dead, probably rotting, before he got to this Derry City line. It would take younger men like Newt and Dick a slightly longer time, but they would also go, and probably in agony, because of the physical changes that had begun in Bobby's shed. It didn't surprise either man that Hilly Brown was in a coma, and he had left when things were just starting to really roll. Tommy Jacklin was 15. Hester Brooklyn was a well-developed 13. They at least had youth on their side, and could hope to leave and come back alive without the equivalent of NASA spacesuits to protect them from what was now an alien and inimical atmosphere. Such equipment would have been out of the question even if they had it. They probably could have cobbled something together. But if a couple of folks showed up at the Napa Auto Parts store in Derry wearing moon suits, there might have been a few questions, or more than a few. I don't like it, Newt said at last. Hell, I don't either, Dick replied. I'm not going to have a minute's peace until they get back. And I've got old Doc Warwick parked out by the Haven Troy line to take care of 'em just as soon as they do. If they do. Ah, yeah, if. I think they will, but they'll be hurtin'. What kind of problems do you expect? Dick shot his head. He didn't know, and Doc Warwick refused to even guess, except to ask Dick, in a cross-mental voice, what he, Dick, thought would happen to a salmon if it decided to ride a bike upstream to the spawning grounds instead of swimming. Well, Newt said doubtfully. Well, nothing, Dick returned. We can't leave the thing. He nodded toward the oscillating clock tower, the way it is. Newt returned. Well, almost down to the hatchway now. I think we could leave it. Maybe. Maybe not. But we need batteries for other things, and you know it. And we need to keep being careful. You know that, too. Don't teach your Grammy to suck eggs, Dick. Fuck you. Fuck that asshole, was what Newt had been about to say, but he squashed it. Although he found more to dislike about Dick Allison with every passing day, the truth was, Haven ran on batteries now. Just like a kid's toy car from FAO Schwartz. And they kept needing more and bigger ones. And mail order was not only too slow. It was the sort of thing that might send up a warning flag to someone somewhere. You could never tell. All in all, Newt Beringer was a troubled man. They had survived the plane crash. If something happened to Tommy and Hester, could they survive that? He didn't know. He only knew he wouldn't have much peace until the kids were back in Haven, where they belonged. 11. Sunday, August 7th. Gardner was at the ship looking at it, trying to decide, again, if any good could come of this mess. And if not, that's the heater. If there was any way out. He had heard the light plane 2 days ago, although he had been in the house and had come out a moment too late to see it on its third pass. 3 passes was just about too many. He had been pretty sure the pilot had spotted the ship in the excavation. The thought had afforded Gardner a strange, bitter relief. Then yesterday, he had seen the story in the paper. He didn't have to be a college graduate to see the connection. Poor old Doc Bailey. Dr. Bailey had wandered off course. and the leftover from the space armada of Ming the Merciless had stripped his gears. Did that make him, Jim Gardner, an accessory to murder? Might. And wife shooter or not, Gard didn't care for the thought. Freeman Moss, the dour woodsman from Albion, hadn't shown up this morning. Gard supposed the ship had blown its fuses as it had those of the others before him. Gard was alone for the first time since Bobbi had disappeared. On the surface, that seemed to open things up. But when you looked deeper, the old conundrums remained. The story of the dead neurosurgeon and the plane crash had been bad. But to Gard's mind, the story above the fold, the one Newton Dick had ignored, was worse. The Mideast was getting ready to explode again. And if there was shooting this time, some of it might be nuclear. The Union of the Concerned Scientists, those happy folks who kept the black clock, had advanced the hands to 2 minutes to nuclear midnight yesterday. The paper reported. Happy days were here again, all right. The ship could maybe pull a pin on all that. But was that what Freeman Moss, Kyle Archenberg, Bozzy, and all the rest of them wanted? Sometimes Gart felt a sickening surety that cooling out of powder keg the planet was sitting on was the last thing that Newton Improved Haven was concerned with. So, he didn't know. Sometimes being a telepathic zero was a pain in the ass. His eye moved to the pumping machinery squashed into the mud at the edge of the trench. Working at the ship had previously been a matter of dust and dirt and rocks and stumps. I couldn't come up until there were just about half crazy with frustration. Until you were, Now it was wet work. Very wet work indeed. The last couple of nights he had gone home with wet clay in his hair, between his toes, and in the crack of his ass. Mud was bad, but clay was worse. Clay stuck. The pumping equipment was the strangest, ugliest conglomeration yet, and it worked. It also weighed tons, but the mostly silent Freeman Moss had transported it from Bobby's dooryard all by himself. It had taken him most of Thursday and about 500 batteries to do it. And he had done it. Something which would have taken an ordinary construction crew a week or more to accomplish. Moss had used a gadget like a metal detector to guide each component to its final resting place. First off the truck, then through the garden, then out along the well-worn path to the dig. The components floated serenely through the warm summer air, their shadows pulled beneath them. Moss carried the thing, which had once been a metal detector, in one hand, something which looked like a walkie-talkie handset in the other. When he raised the curved stainless steel antenna on the end of the walkie-talkie gadget and moved the dish at the end of the detector, the motor or pump would rise. When he moved them to the left, the piece of equipment went left. Guard watching this, with the bemusement of a veteran drunk. Surely no one sees as many strange things as one of those. Thought that Moss looked like a scrofulous animal trainer, leading mechanical elephants through the woods to the site of some unimaginable circus. Gardner had seen the laborious moving of enough heavy equipment to know that this device could revolutionize construction techniques. Such things were outside his practical knowledge, but he guessed that a single gadget such as the one Moss had used on Thursday, with its absent ease, could cut the cost of the project size of the Oswin Dam by 25% or more. At least in one respect, however, it was like the illusion being maintained at the town hall. It required a lot of juice. Here, Moss said, handing Gard a heavy pack sack. Put this on. Gard winced, shouldering the straps. Moss saw it and smiled a little. It'll get lighter as the day goes along. Don't you worry about that. He plugged the jack into the transistor earphone into the side a transistor earphone into the side of the radio controller and pushed the phone into his ear. "What's in the pack?" Gardner asked. "Batteries. Let's go." Moss had switched the gadget on, seemed to listen, nod, and then pointed the curved antenna at the first motor. It rose in the air and hung there. Holding the controller in one hand and the customized metal detector in the other, Moss walked toward the motor. For every step he took, the motor retreated a similar distance. Guard brought up the rear. Moss walked the motor between the house and the shed, urging it around the Tomcat, and then ahead of him through Bobbi's garden. A wide path had been worn through this, but on both sides of it, the plants continued to grow in rampant splendor. Some of the sunflowers were now 12 feet high. They reminded Gardner of the day of the Raffids. One night about a week ago, he had awakened with a terrible nightmare. In it, the sunflowers in the garden had uprooted themselves and begun to walk. Eldritch light shining from their centers and onto the ground like the beams of flashlights with green lenses. There were summer squashes in the garden as big as U-boat torpedoes, tomatoes the size of basketballs. Some of the corn was nearly as high as the sunflowers. Curious, Gardner had picked one of the ears. It was easily 2 feet long, a single ear. It had been good. Would have fed 2 hungry men, but Guard had spat out the single mouthful of butter and sugar kernels he had bitten off, grimacing and wiping his mouth. The taste had been meaty and hideous. Bobbi had grown a garden full of huge plants. The vegetables were inedible, perhaps even poisonous. The motor had cruised serenely ahead of them along the path, cornstalks rustling and bending on either side as it pushed its way through. Gardner saw smears and swatches of grease and engine oil on some of the military green sword-like leaves. On the far side of the garden, the motor began to sag. Moss had lowered the antenna, and the motor settled to the earth with a gentle thump. "What's up?" Gardner had asked. Moss only grunted and produced a dime. He stuck it in the base of the controller, twisted it, and pulled 6 AA door cells out of the battery compartment. He tossed them indifferently on the ground. "Give me some more," he said. Gardner unshouldered the knapsack, undid the straps, opened the flap, and saw what looked at first like a billion AA's. It was as if someone had hit the grand jackpot at Atlantic City and the machine had paid off in batteries instead of bucks. "Jesus!" "I ain't him," Moss said. "Give me half a dozen of those suckers." For once, Guard didn't seem to have a wisecrack left in him. He handed 6 batteries over and watched Moss fit them into the compartment. Then Moss replaced the battery hutch, turned it on, fitted the earplug in his ear, and said, "Let's go." 40 yards into the woods. Ew. There was another battery change. 60 yards, another one. 60 yards later, another. Floating, the motor sucked less juice when it was going downhill. But by the time Moss had finally settled the big motor block on the edge of the trench, they had gone through 42 batteries. Back and forth, one by one, they brought the pieces of pumping machinery from Freeman Moss's truck to the edge of the trench. The knapsack on Gardner's back grew steadily lighter. On the 4th trip, Gardner had asked Moss if he could try a large industrial pump, whose raison d'etre before this odd little side trip had probably been pumping sewage from clogged septic tanks, sitting in the tilted angle about 100 yards from the trench. Moss was once more changing batteries. Dead AA's lay along the path now, reminding Guard with odd poignance of the kid at Arcadia Beach. The kid with the firecrackers. The kid whose mother had given up drinking and everything else. The kid who had known about the Tommyknockers. "Well, you can give it a try." Moss handed over the gadget. "I could use a smidge of help, and he wouldn't mind saying so." Where the man's out lifting all that? Where's a man out lifting all that? He saw Gardner look and said, "Oh, I'm doing part of it myself. That's what the plug's for. You can carry it, but I don't think you'll have much luck. You ain't like us." I noticed. I'm the one that isn't going to have to buy a set of teeth from Sears and Roebuck when all this is over. Moss looked at him sourly and said nothing. Gardner used his handkerchief to wipe off the brown coating of wax Moss had left on the earplug, then stuck it in his ear. He heard a distant sound, like one you hear when you held a conch shell to your ear. He pointed the antenna at the pump as he had seen Moss do, then cautiously flickered the antenna upward. The quality of the dim seashore rumbled in his ear. The quality of the dim seashore rumbled in his ear. Changed. Oh, seashore rumble in his ear changed. The pump moved the tiniest bit. He was sure it wasn't just his imagination. But an instant later, two other things happened. He felt warm blood coursing down his face from his nose, and his head was filled with a blaring voice. "Carpet your den, or your whole home for less," screamed some radio announcer. He had suddenly sitting right in the middle of Gardner's head, and apparently yelling into the electric bullhorn. "And yes, we do have a new shipment of throw rugs. The last one sold out fast. So be sure." "Ow, Jesus, shut up," Gardner had cried. He dropped the headset and reached for his head. The earphone had dragged out of his ear, and the blaring announcer cut out. He had been left with a nosebleed and a head that was ringing like a bell. Freeman Moss, startled out of his taciturnity, stared at Gardner with wide eyes. "What in Christ's name was that?" he asked. "That," Gardner said weakly, "was WZON. Where it's only rock and roll because that's the way you like it. You mind if I sit down for a minute, Moss? Think I just pissed myself. Your nose is bleeding too." "No shit, Sherlock," Gardner said. "Think maybe you better let me use the lifter after this." Gard had been more than happy to abide by that. It took them the rest of the day to get all the equipment out to the trench. And Moss was so tired when the last piece arrived that Gardner had to practically carry the man back to his truck. "Feel like I just chopped 2 cord of wood and shit my brains out while I was doing it," the old man gasped. After that, Gard hadn't really expected the man to come back, but Moss had shown up promptly at 7 the next day. He had been driving the beat-up, split-grill Pontiac instead of his truck. He got out of the Pontiac banging a dinner bucket along his leg. "Come on, let's get to it." Gardner respected Moss more than the other 3 helpers put together. In fact, he liked him. Moss glanced at him as they walked out to the ship with the morning dew of that Friday morning wetting down the cuffs of his pants. "Caught that one," he grunted. "You're okay too, I guess." That was about all Mr. Freeman Moss had to say to him that day. They sank the nest of hoses into the trench and rigged more hoses, outflow hoses this time. To direct the water, they pumped out downhill on a slope that ran a bit southeast of Bobbi's place. The dump hoses, as Moses called them, were big, wide bore rolls of canvas that Gard supposed had been scavenged from the VFD. "Ah, yeah, got a few there, got a few other places," Moss said, and would offer no more on that subject. Before starting the pumps, he had Gardner put a pound of U-shaped clamps over the dump hoses, else they'd go whipping around, spraying water everywhere. If you've ever seen a fireman's hose out of control, you know someone can get hurt. And we ain't got enough men to stand around holding a bunch of piston hoses all day. Not that there'd be any volunteers standing in line, right? Freeman Moss had looked at him silently, saying nothing for a moment. Then he grunted. "Found these clamps in good. We'll still have to stop pretty often to pound 'em back in." they'll loosen up. Can't you control the outflow so that you don't have to bother with all these clamp and shit? Gardner asked. Moss rolled his eyes impatiently at his ignorance. Sure, he said. But there's one fuck of a lot of water down in that hole, and I'd like to get that one before doomsday. Get it out before doomsday, if it's all the same to you. Bard held out his hand, half laughing. Hey, I was just asking, he said. Peace. The man had only grunted in his inimitable Freeman Moss style. By 9:30, water was pouring downhill and away from the ship at a great rate. It was cold and clear and as sweet as water can be. Which is sweet indeed, as anyone with a good well could attest. By noon, they had created a brand new stream. It was 6 feet wide, shallow, but brawling right along, carrying pine needles, looming black topsoil, small shrubs away. There was not much for the men to do but to sit around and make sure none of the plump, straining dumper hoses came free and started to fly around, spraying water like bombed-out fire hydrants. Moss shut the pumps down regularly in sequence, so they could pound in the loose clamps, or switch them to a new place if the ground was getting loose where they had been. By 3 o'clock, the stream was rolling larger bushes downstream, and just before 5 o'clock, Gardner heard the rending rumble of a biggish tree going over. He sat up, craned his neck, but it had happened too far down the new stream's course to see. Sounded like a pine, Moss said. It was Gardner's turn to look at Moss and say nothing. Might have been a spruce, Moss said. And although the man's face remained perfectly straight, Gardner believed Moss might have made a joke. A small one, but a joke, just the same. Is this water reaching the road, do you think? Oh, I should suspect. It'll wash it out, won't it? Nope. Town crew's already putting in new culvert, large bore. Suppose they'll have a detour traffic couple of days while they tear up the Tarvey. But they ain't much traffic out here as there used to be anyway. I noticed, Gardner said. Damn good thing, if you ask me. Summer people always a pain in the ass. Look at here, Gardner. I'm going to cut the outflow on the pumps way down. And they'll still pump 15, maybe 17 gallons a minute overnight. With 4 pumps working, that's 6,800 gallons an hour. That's 3,800 gallons an hour. All night long. Not bad for running on automatic. Come on, let's go. In ship's lovely, but it makes my blood pressure jumpy. I'll drink one of your beers before I head home to the missus, if you'll let it be so. Moss had shown up again yesterday, Saturday. Oh, okay. So this is still the same day. All right. In his old Pontiac, and had promptly run the pumps up to capacity. 35 gallons per minute each. 8,400 gallons an hour. This morning, no Freeman Moss. He had finally played out like the others, leaving Gardner to consider same old options. First option, business as usual. Second option, run like hell. He had already come to the conclusion that if Bobbi died, he would suffer a fatal accident soon afterward. It might take as long as half an hour for him to have it. If he decided to run, he would know in advance. Would they know in advance? Gardner didn't think so. He and the rest of Haven still played poker the old-fashioned way, with all the cards dealt face down. Oh, and by the way, gang, how far would he have to run to get out of the reach of them and their Buck Rogers gadgetry? Actually, Gardner didn't think it would be that far. Derry, Bangor, even Augusta. All those must be too close. Portland, maybe? Probably. Because of what he thought of as the cigarette analogy. When a kid started to smoke, He was lucky if he could get through half a butt without puking his guts out, or almost fainting. After 6 months' experience, he might be able to get through 5 or 10 butts a day. Give a kid 3 years, and you had yourself a 2.5-pack-a-day candidate for lung cancer. Then turn it over. Tell the kid who had just finished his first butt and who was wandering around green-faced and gagging that he has to quit smoking, or he'll fall down and kiss your ass. Catch him when he's doing 5 or 10 smokes a day, and you'll get a kid who probably doesn't care much one way or another. Although a kid habituated, even at that level, may find himself eating too many sweets and wishing for a smoke when he's bored or nervous. Gardner thought. But take your smoking vet. Tell him he's got to quit the coffin nails, and he clutches his chest like a man who's having a heart attack. We are not going to get through 10 like I wanted. Like, we still have quite a bit to go, so I'm not sure how far I'll get. Coffin nails, and he clutches his chest like a man who's having a heart attack. Only he's just protecting the smokes in the breast pocket of his shirt. Smoking, Gardner knew from his own mostly successful efforts to either quit the habit or at least damp it down to less than lethal vice, the physical addiction. In the first week off cigarettes, smokers suffer from jitters, headaches, muscle spasms. Doctors may prescribe B12 to quit the worst of these symptoms. They know, however, that there are no pills to combat the ex-smoker's feelings of loss and depression during the 6 months which begin the instant the smoker crushes out his last butt and starts his or her lonely voyage out of addiction. And Haven, Gardner thought now, running the pumps up to full power, is like a smoke-filled room. They were sick here at first. They were like a bunch of kids learning to smoke corn shucks out behind the barn. But now they like the air in the room. And why not? They're the ultimate chain smokers. If the air they breathe, and God knows what kind of physiological changes are going on in the brains and bodies. Lung sections show formation of oat cells in the lung tissue of people who have been smoking for only 18 months. There's a high incidence of brain tumors in towns where there are high pollution mills operating, or, God save us, nuclear reactors. So what is he going to do then? So what is this going to do them? He didn't know. He had seen no surface observable changes except for the loss of teeth and the increased shortness of temper. But he didn't think they'd chase him very far if he spilt. They might begin by lighting out after him with a fervor of a posse in a Republic Western. But he somehow thought they would lose interest very quickly. As soon as the withdrawal symptoms set in, it would. He got all 4 pumps running at top speed, swelling the creek into a wide stream almost at once. Then he began the day's work of checking the U-clamps, which held the hoses still. If he got away, his chances were 2. Keep his mouth shut or blow the whistle. He knew that. For a variety of reasons, he could probably keep quiet, which meant simply dealing himself out, writing off the last month of back-breaking labor, writing off any chance to change the suicidal course of the world politics at a stroke. Most of all, writing off his good friend and erstwhile lover, Bobbi Anderson, who had been in absentia for the best part of 2 weeks now. Third option, get rid of it, blow it up, destroy it. Make it no more than another vague rumor, like the supposed aliens at Hangar 18. In spite of his dull fury at the insanity of nuclear power and energy-swilling technocratic pigs who had created it, Good Lord. Make sure everything's okay. And underwritten it, and refused to see its dangers even in the wake of Chernobyl. In spite of his depression at the AP wire photo of the scientists advancing the black clock at 2 minutes before midnight, he finally recognized the possibility that destroying the ship might be the best thing he could possibly do. The oxidation of whatever had been impregnated in the surface of its hull, deliberately, he had no doubt, had created a cornucopia of mind-blowing gadgets out here. God alone knew what wonderful things might be waiting inside. But there was other stuff, wasn't there? The neurosurgeon in the plane crash, the old man and the big state cop. Maybe the lady constable, Mrs. McCausland. Maybe the 2 other state cops who had disappeared. Maybe even the brown kid. How much of this could be laid at the door of this thing he was staring at, which was jetting out of the ground like a breaching snout of the greatest white whale ever dreamed of? Some, all, none of the above? Gardner was sure of one thing. It wasn't the last. That the ship in the earth was the font of creation was undeniable, but it was also the wrecked craft of an unknowable species from somewhere far out in the blackness, creatures whose minds might be as different from those of human beings as human minds were from the minds of spiders. It was a marvelous, improbable artifact shining in the hazy sunlight of the Sunday morning. But it was also a haunted house where demons might still stalk behind the walls and in the hollow places. There were times when there were times when he would look at it and feel his throat fill up with strangeness, as at the sight of flat eyes staring up at him from the earth. But get rid of it how? Blow it up how? How? Even supposing he wanted to, how would he do it? The packet charges they had used to chop up the bedrock holding the ship fast were more powerful than dynamite. They didn't even scratch the hull of the thing. Was he supposed to trot off to Limestone Air Force Base, steal an A-bomb, moving it with silky, unbelievable smoothness of Dirk Pitt in a Clive Cussler novel? And wouldn't it be funny? Wouldn't it really be the last laugh? He actually did manage to get a nuke and set it off, only to discover that all he really managed to do was to set the ship still uncannily unharmed and unscathed free at a stroke. Those were his options, a third of which was not an option at all. Apparently his hands had known more than his brain, for while he went on turning them over in his mind for the umpteenth time, he went calmly, the full blast, sure it was falling rapidly. He guessed that blessing and excavation could begin again on Wednesday, Thursday at the latest. And once they got going again, the work would go fast. The rock of the aquifer was spongy and large poured. They wouldn't need to waste time digging glory holes for explosives, because there would be enough natural spots for not just exploring ratios, but satchel charges. The next phase would be like moving from a dense, gluey batter to a fresh, rising dough. Gardner stood bent over the cut of the earth for some time, shining the bead light into the black depths. Then he clicked it off, meaning to inspect the clumps again. Hair boiling at 3 in the morning, and already he wanted a drink. He turned around. Bobbi was standing there. Gardner's mouth dropped open. He closed it with a snap after a moment and started toward her, fully expecting this hallucination to grow transparent, then be gone. But Bobbi stayed solid, and Gardner saw that she had lost a great deal of hair. Her brow, pale and shining white, extended back nearly to the middle of her skull, leaving the world's biggest widow's peak in the center. Nor were these newly exposed sections of skull the only pale things about her. She looked like someone who had been through a terrible, debilitating illness. Her right arm was in a sling, and she's wearing makeup. Pancake makeup. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. She laid it on heavy, the way a lady does when she wants to cover up a bruise. But it's her, Bobbi, no dream. His eyes suddenly filled with tears. Bobbi doubled, then trebled. It wasn't until then, that moment, that he realized just how scared he had been. And how lonely. Bobbi? He asked hoarsely. Is it really you? Bobbi smiled. That old sweet smile he loved so well. The one that had saved him from his own idiot self so often. It was Bobbi. It was Bobbi, and he loved her. He went to her, put his arms around her, laid his tired face against her neck. He had done this before, too. Hello, guard, she said, and began to cry. He was crying, too. He kissed her, kissed her, kissed her. His hands had suddenly all over her. Her free one was on him. No, he said, still kissing her. No, you can't. Shh, I have to. My last chance, guard. Our last chance. Kissed, they kissed. Oh, they kissed, and now her shirt was unbuttoned, and this was not the body of a sex goddess. It was white and sickish, the muscles flabby, the breasts saggy. But he loved it, and kissed her, and their tears were all over each other's faces. Guard, my dear, always my... Shh. Oh, please, I love you. Bobbi, I love... Kiss me. Kiss. Yes. High needles under them, sweetness, her tears, his tears, they kissed. 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 And as he entered her, Guard realized two things at once. How much he had missed her, and that not a single bird was singing. The woods were dead. Kissed. 12. Guard used his shirt, not very clean anyway, to wipe swatches of brown makeup from his naked body. It hadn't just been her face. Had she come out here expecting to make love to him? Something it might be just as well not to think about now anyway. Although they both should have been Thanksgiving, oh my gosh. Although they both should have been Thanksgiving dinner for the noseums and moose flies spouting sweat as they had been doing, he hadn't a single bite. He didn't think Bobbi had any either. It's not only an IQ booster, he thought, looking at the ship. It's got every insect repellent on the market. Beat hollow. He tossed the shirt aside and touched Bobbi's face, running a finger down her cheek, picking up a little more of the makeup. Most of it, however, had either been sweated off or washed away by her tears. I hurt you, he said. You loved me, she answered. What? You hear me, guard? I know you do. Are you angry? He asked, aware that the barriers were going up again, aware that he was acting again, aware that it was all over, all the things they had were finally over. These were sorry things to be aware of. Is that why you won't talk to me? He paused. I wouldn't blame you. You put up with a lot of shit from me over the years, woman. I was talking to you, she said, and sorry as he was to be lying to her after loving her. He was glad to sense her doubt. With my mind? I didn't hear you. You did before. You heard, and you answered. We talked, guard. We were closer to that. He flagged an arm at the ship. She smiled wanly up at him and put her cheek against his shoulder. With most of the makeup scrubbed away, her flesh was an unsettling translucence. Did I hurt you? No. Yes, a little. She smiled. It was that old Bobbi Anderson go-to-hell grin, but a final tear ran slowly down her cheek nonetheless. It was worth it. We saved the best for last, guard. He kissed her gently, but now her lips were different. The lips of new and improved Roberta Gardner. First, last, or in the middle. I didn't have any business making love to you, and you don't have any business out here. I look tired, I know, Bobbi said, and I'm wearing a lot of goop, as you already found out. You were right. I let myself get tired, and I had something like a complete physical breakdown. Bullshit, guard thought. But he covered this thought with white noise so Bobbi couldn't read it. He did this with barely a conscious thought. Such hiding was becoming second nature to him now. The treatment was radical. It's resulted in some superficial skin problems, some hair loss, but it'll all grow back. Oh, Gardner said, thinking. You still can't lie for shit, Bobbi. Well, I'm glad you're all right, but you may be out to take a couple of days off. Put your feet up. No, Bobbi said quietly. This is the time for the final push, Guard. We're almost there. We started this, you and me. No, Gardner said. You started it, Bobbi. You literally stumbled over it. Back when Peter was alive, remember? Guard saw pain in Bobbi's eyes at the mention of Peter. Then it was gone. She shrugged Guard's qualification off. You were here soon enough. You saved my life. I wouldn't be here without you. So let's do it together, Guard. I bet it's no more than another 25 feet below to that hatchway. Garner had a strong hunch she was right, but he suddenly didn't feel like admitting it. There was a spike turning and turning in his heart. The pain was worse than any hangover headache he'd ever had. If you think so, I'll take your word for it. Is it 84 or is it 80? Yeah, we might have to stop. If you think so, I'll take your word for it. What do you say, Guard? 1 more mile, you and me? He sat thoughtfully, looking at Bobbi, noticing how still, how almost malignant the woods seemed with no birdsong in them. This is how it would be. This is how it will be. If one of their asshole power plants ever does melt down, people will have smarts enough to get out. If they're warned in time, that is. And if the power plant in question, or the NRC, have balls enough to tell them. But you can't tell an owl or woodpecker to clear the area. You can't tell a scarlet tanager not to look at the fireball. So their eyes will melt, and they'll just go flapping around, blind as bats, running into trees and the sides of buildings, till they starve to death, or break their necks. Is this a spaceship, Bobbi? Or is it a great big containment housing that's already leaking? It has, hasn't it? That's why these woods are so quiet. That's why the polyester-clad neurologist bird fell out of the sky on Friday, isn't it? What do you say, Guard? 1 more mile? So where's the good solution? Where's peace with honor? Do you run? Do you turn it over to the American Dallas Police so they can use it on the Soviet Dallas Police? What? Any new ideas, Guard? And suddenly, he did have an idea. Or the glimmer of one. And the glimmer was better than nothing. He hugged Bobbi with a lying arm. Okay, 1 more mile. Bobbi's grin started to widen, and then it became a look of curious surprise. How much did he leave you, Guard? How much did who leave me? The tooth fairy, Bobbi said. You finally lost one, right there in the front. Startled and a little afraid, Guard raised his hand to his mouth. Sure enough, there was a gap where one of the incisors had been yesterday. It had started then. After a month working in the shadow of the thing, he had foolishly assumed immunity, but it wasn't so. It had started. He was finally on his way to becoming new and improved. On his way to becoming. He forced an answering smile. I hadn't noticed, he said. You feel any different? No, Guard said truthfully. Not yet, anyway. What do you say? You want to do some work? I'll do what I can, Bobbi said, with this arm. You can check the hoses and tell me if any of them are starting to come loose. And talk to me. He looked at Bobbi with an awkward smile. None of those other guys knew how to talk, man. I mean, they were sincere, but, Bobbi smiled back, and Gardner saw another brilliant, unalloyed flash of the old Bobbi. And Gardner, saw. The woman he had loved. He remembered the safe, dark harbor of her neck, and that screw in his heart turned again. I think I do, he said. And I think I'll talk your ear off. That's what you want. I've been lonely too. They stood together, smiling at each other, and it was almost the same, but the woods were silent, with no birdsong to fill them up. The love's over, he thought. Now it's the same old poker game, except the tooth fairy came last night, and I guess the bastard will be back tonight, probably along with his cousin and his brother-in-law. And when they start seeing my cards, maybe exposing that glimmer of an idea, like an ace in the hole, it'll be all over. In a way, it's funny. We always assumed the aliens would have to at least be alive to invade. Not even H.G. Wells expected an invasion of ghosts. I want to have a look into the trench, Bobbi said. Okay. You like the way it's draining, I think. Together, they walked to the shadow cast by the ship. Alright, we're going to leave at that because it's already an hour and a half. And I need a break as far as talking. So, tonight at about 7, 8 o'clock, I might have to switch over to 8 on some nights, but tonight around 7 I should be back on. And we'll finish up 10 and probably get into 11. Or into the third section, I mean. Jeez. This is 20 chapters, and we have 10 more. So, we'll see how things go. I wasn't even paying attention. That explains that. Alright, so I will see you guys later. Y'all follow. If you haven't, I will talk to you soon. Thank you for joining me. Don't forget I love y'all, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.